I don't know who needs to hear this, but if you've ever lost everything and felt like God went silent, if you're doing all the right things but life keeps falling apart, if your faith is being tested in ways you never imagined possible, this story is for you. This is the story of Job, and it might change how you see suffering forever. Picture the ancient land of Uz, a vast desert of rolling sand and stone beneath an endless sky. It's here, in this unforgiving wilderness, that our story begins. Why do the righteous suffer while the wicked prosper? And why does God seem so quiet when we need him most? These aren't new questions. They're as ancient as humanity itself, and 3,000 years ago, in that desert of Uz, they were answered in one of the most mysterious and beautiful stories ever told. There lived a man who would face a test unlike any other in human history. His name was Job. He wasn't royalty or a prophet. He was an ordinary man, faithful and real. And that's what makes his story extraordinary. By every measure, his life proved that righteousness leads to blessing. Wealth, family, honor, job, had it all, until the day everything collapsed. In one afternoon, Job lost his wealth, his servants, and all 10 of his children. Then his health failed, his body covered in painful sores from head to foot. His friends became his accusers. His wife, drowning in grief, urged him to curse God and die. Job sat in ashes, scraping his wounds with broken pottery, and cried out the question that echoes through every hospital room, every funeral, every sleepless night. Why? But here's what makes Job's story so powerful and so unsettling. Job never receives the clarity he pleads for. Heaven stays silent, not because God is absent, but because he's about to reveal something deeper. What Job receives instead is an encounter with God himself. This isn't a story about a man who suffers and gets an explanation. It's a story about faith that refuses to let go even when answers don't come. It's about worship in the worst moments. It's about trusting God when everything in your life screams that he's abandoned you. Because Job's story isn't ancient history. It's every believer's midnight question. God, are you still here? Maybe you know what that feels like. The sudden diagnosis, the job loss that makes no sense, the relationship that's shattered without warning, the prayer that seems to vanish into silence. If you're in that place, sitting in your own ashes, surrounded by voices that don't understand, crying out to a God who seems far away, Job's story was written for you. It won't give you easy answers. It won't tie suffering up in a neat theological bow, but it will show you what faith looks like when it's tested to the absolute breaking point. And it will reveal a God who is present even in the mystery, sovereign even in the storm, and faithful even when he's silent. As Job's cry rises from the ashes, we step back to understand the world he lived in, a time and place where faith and fortune were inseparable and where this story first began. Before we dive deeper into Job's story, we need to understand the world that shaped it. Because the book of Job isn't just ancient literature, it's a window into how people understood God, suffering and justice in a time very different from our own. Here's something fascinating. We don't actually know who wrote the book of Job. The text itself never tells us. Over the centuries, scholars have suggested Moses or Solomon. Others believe it's even older, an oral tradition carefully preserved in written form. But maybe the anonymity is intentional. Maybe the unknown author understood that this story isn't about human wisdom or literary achievement, it's about God. And sometimes the most powerful testimonies are the ones where the storyteller steps into the shadows so the story itself can shine. What we do know is this: the book of Job is ancient, possibly one of the oldest texts in Scripture, and it unfolds in a world that feels foreign to us. The land of Uz. Most scholars place it east of the Jordan River, in what is now modern-day Saudi Arabia or northern Jordan. Picture vast desert routes where caravans of camels carried spices and gold across the ancient Near East. Nomadic tribes living in tents, their wealth measured not in currency but in livestock. Sheep, camels, oxen, donkeys. This was the patriarchal period, a time before Moses, before the law, before Israel had kings or temples. Job lived in an era when families gathered under the stars, when the eldest son led sacrifices, when a man's reputation was his most valuable possession. In Job's world, there was a dominant belief that shaped everything. Prosperity equals divine favor, and suffering equals divine punishment. It was simple, logical. If you were blessed, it meant God approved of you. If you suffered, it meant you had sinned. The equation seemed airtight. Job himself was living proof of this theology. The greatest man in the East, thousands of animals, respected servants, 10 healthy children. Every morning Job would rise before dawn to offer sacrifices on behalf of his family, ensuring they remained covered by God's grace. Everything about Job's life whispered the same message. See, righteousness works. But here's what makes the book of Job so revolutionary. It's about to shatter that entire worldview. The cultural assumptions that made perfect sense in Job's time and that still whisper in our own are about to be tested. Because what happens when the most righteous man on earth loses everything? What happens when suffering strikes someone who has done nothing to deserve it? That question didn't just haunt Job's world, it haunts ours. Even today we hear those echoes, when tragedy strikes, when others prosper, when prayers go unanswered. We instinctively wonder, what did I do wrong? Or, does God approve of them more than me? The book of Job confronts this theology head-on, and what it reveals is far more complex, far more mysterious, and far more true to human experience than any simple formula could capture. One more thing worth noting, the book of Job is structured uniquely. It opens with prose, straightforward narrative, then it shifts into poetry for the bulk of the book. Finally, it returns to prose for the ending. Why does this matter? Because poetry captures what prose cannot. The wrestling of the soul, the cry of faith under pressure, the mystery that refuses simple explanation. Job's world believed in clear categories, but Job's story is about to reveal a God whose ways transcend human categories, a God who governs the universe with wisdom we cannot fully grasp, but can learn to trust. Now, with the world of Job in view, let's meet the man himself. The Bible introduces Job with words that should stop us in our tracks. There was a man in the land of Uz, whose name was Job, and that man was blameless and upright, one who feared God and turned away from evil. Blameless, upright, God-fearing, and deliberately righteous, these aren't casual compliments. This is Scripture's way of saying, pay attention. You're about to meet someone extraordinary. But let's be clear about what blameless means, because it's easy to misunderstand. Job wasn't sinless. Only one person in human history could claim that. Blameless means wholehearted, a man whose integrity went all the way through, whose private life matched his public reputation, whose devotion to God wasn't performance but genuine relationship. Upright means he walked the straight path. He dealt honestly with others. He kept his word. He didn't cut corners or exploit the vulnerable. In a world where power often corrupted, Job's character remained consistent. He feared God, not with cowering terror, but with reverent awe, the kind of respect that recognizes who God is and responds with worship. Job's fear of the Lord was the beginning of his wisdom, and he turned away from evil, actively, intentionally. This wasn't passive avoidance, it was deliberate pursuit of righteousness. When temptation came, Job walked the other direction. Now imagine what this looked like in daily life. Every morning before dawn, Job was already awake, preparing sacrifices not for himself, but for his children. "Perhaps my children have sinned and cursed God in their hearts," he would think. So he offered burnt offerings for each of them, 10 sacrifices, born not from religious obligation, but from a father's love. Job understood something many forget. Sin isn't just about outward behavior, it's about the heart. And he wanted his children covered, their hearts aligned with God, even when he couldn't see what they were thinking. This was Job's rhythm. Day after day, year after year, prayer and sacrifice before the sun rose. A man who took his relationship with God and his family's relationship with God seriously. But Job wasn't just spiritually devoted, he was also remarkably blessed. Thousands of sheep and camels, hundreds of oxen and donkeys. His estate was vast. The servants who managed it all weren't just employees. They were part of an extended household that depended on Job's leadership and provision. By every economic measure, Job was the greatest of all the people of the East. Picture what that means. Merchants traveled to seek his counsel. Leaders came to hear his wisdom. His name carried weight across the region. When Job spoke, people listened. But here's what's remarkable. Wealth didn't corrupt him. Money has a way of changing people. It whispers lies about self-sufficiency. It tempts us toward pride, greed, and isolation from those who have less. But not Job. His prosperity became a platform for generosity, not selfishness. His influence became a tool for justice, not oppression. Job knew something we often forget. Everything he had was a gift from God, not something he'd earned because he was righteous. His wealth didn't prove his goodness. It provided opportunity to reflect God's character. Think about the business owner who treats employees with dignity, paying fair wages even when no one's watching. The wealthy person who gives quietly, never seeking recognition. The parent who prays over their children daily, not out of fear but out of love for God and family. The faithful person who worships without an audience. That was Job. His life wasn't divided into spiritual and secular compartments. His faith shaped how he conducted business. His devotion to God influenced how he treated servants. His morning prayers informed his afternoon decisions. Job's righteousness wasn't a Sunday performance. It was a Monday through Saturday reality, and everyone could see it. The text tells us Job was not only blameless before God, but also blameless in the eyes of others. His reputation matched his character. What he was in private, he was in public. What he claimed to believe, he actually lived. In a world that often equated blessing with divine approval, Job seemed to be the perfect proof. Here was a man who honored God, and God had clearly honored him in return. The theology was simple. Live righteously, receive blessing. But Job's story is about to challenge that entire framework. Because what happens when the most righteous man on earth loses everything? What happens when suffering strikes someone who has done nothing to deserve it? Job's devotion wasn't performance. It was genuine relationship. He didn't love God for what he could get. He loved God for who God is. That kind of faith, the kind rooted in who God is, not what he gives, is about to be tested. While Job faithfully offered sacrifices in the land of Uz, something was happening in a realm he couldn't see. A conversation was unfolding in heaven that would change his life forever. The scene opens like a cosmic courtroom. The angels, called sons of God in the Hebrew text, present themselves before the throne of the Almighty. These are powerful beings who have witnessed the wonders of creation, who serve in God's presence, who carry out his will across the universe. But among them moves a figure who doesn't belong to their company, Satan. The Hebrew word is ha-Satan, literally the accuser. He's the prosecuting attorney of heaven, fresh from roaming the earth. God turns his attention to him. "Where have you come from?" Satan's reply is chilling in its casualness. "From roaming throughout the earth, going back and forth on it." Picture that. The accuser wandering the world like a predator, watching humanity, searching for weakness, cataloguing failures. He knows human hearts and how quickly devotion crumbles under pressure. Then God does something unexpected. He points Satan's attention toward one specific man. Have you considered my servant Job? There's pride in God's voice, confidence. He's not just tolerating Job, he's showcasing him. There is no one on earth like him. He is blameless and upright, a man who fears God and shuns evil. This is the highest commendation imaginable, God himself declaring that Job stands above every other person on the planet in righteousness and devotion. But Satan isn't impressed. Instead, he sneers and launches an accusation that cuts to the very heart of human worship. Does Job fear God for nothing? Let that question sink in. Satan isn't questioning Job's behavior. He's questioning Job's motives. He's claiming that all human devotion is fundamentally transactional, that we only love God because of what we get from him. Satan continues, have you not put a hedge around him and blessed everything he has? Of course he worships you. You've made his life easy, protected him from every threat, made him wealthy and successful. But stretch out your hand and strike everything he has, and he will surely curse you to your face. This is more than an attack on Job. It's an attack on the very nature of faith itself. Satan is claiming that genuine, selfless worship doesn't exist, that every prayer is a transaction, that every act of devotion is motivated by what we hope to receive, that love for God is always, ultimately, love for ourselves. The watching angels stand silent. All of heaven waits for God's response. Very well, God says. Everything he has is in your power, but on the man himself, do not lay a finger. Here we need to pause and understand something crucial. This isn't a battle of equals. Satan can't act independently, he must ask permission, and God sets the limits. Satan has freedom, but only within boundaries that God defines. Why does God allow this? Why permit Satan to attack a righteous man? The text doesn't fully answer that question, but we see hints. God has absolute confidence in Job's faith. This isn't divine cruelty, it's divine certainty. God knows something Satan doesn't. He knows Job's devotion is real, that it runs deeper than circumstances, that it's rooted not in blessings but in relationship, and there's something else happening here, something Job will never know about. His suffering isn't random. It isn't meaningless. In ways he can't see and wouldn't understand even if he could, Job's faith is answering a cosmic question. Heaven and hell are watching. Angels are witnessing. And the nature of human worship itself is being put to the test. Satan leaves the divine presence with permission granted. He's planning his assault, calculating how to strip Job of everything he values. He's convinced that once the blessings are gone, the devotion will follow. But here's the dramatic irony that makes this story so powerful. Job has no idea any of this is happening. He doesn't know about the heavenly courtroom. He doesn't know about Satan's accusation. When tragedy strikes, and it's about to strike with devastating force, Job will experience it as random, senseless suffering. He'll cry out for answers he'll never receive. He'll demand explanations God will never give. Just like us, we face trials without knowing the heavenly conversations behind them. We suffer without understanding the purposes being worked out beyond our sight. We cry, why, into what feels like divine silence. Job's story is showing us something profound. Trust doesn't require omniscience. Faith means believing that God is working even when we can't see his hand, even when his purposes remain hidden, even when heaven stays silent. What Job sees as loss, heaven sees as testimony. The stage is set, Satan is unleashed, and Job, faithful, blameless Job, has no idea his world is about to collapse. The day began like any other. Job's children gathered at their eldest brother's house for a feast. Laughter, wine, celebration. Out in the fields, Oxen plowed the earth in steady rows, while donkeys grazed nearby. On the hillsides, 7,000 sheep rested under the watchful eyes of shepherds. Everything hummed with the rhythm of normalcy. Nothing in the morning sky warned what was coming. Then the first messenger burst through the door. His clothes were torn, his face pale with terror. He could barely catch his breath. "Master, the Sabaeans attacked while we were plowing. They took the oxen and donkeys, the servants." His voice cracked. "They killed them all. Everyone. I'm the only one who escaped to tell you." Job's hands gripped the table. His mind raced to comprehend. Raiders, his livestock, his servants, dead. But before he could speak, before he could even process the news, a second messenger stumbled in, his face blackened with soot, his body trembling. "Fire fell from the sky," he gasped. "Fire from God himself. It consumed the sheep and the shepherds, all of them. 7,000 sheep, Master. Gone. I alone survived." The room spun. Fire from heaven? But there was no time to think, no space to breathe. A third messenger appeared, covered in dust, blood streaming from a gash above his eye. "The Chaldeans!" he shouted. 3 raiding parties swept down on the camels. They took everything, all 3,000. The servants, they put them to the sword. Only I escaped. 3 messengers, 3 catastrophes. In minutes, the wealth Job had built over a lifetime had vanished like smoke. But none of that mattered when the 4th messenger arrived. This one moved slowly. His face was drained of color. His lips trembled as he tried to form words that no father should ever have to hear. "Your children," he whispered. Job's heart stopped. "They were feasting at your oldest son's house when a mighty wind came from the desert. It struck all 4 corners of the house at once." Silence. The walls collapsed. The roof caved in. The messenger's voice broke. "Master, they're all gone. All 10 of them. I'm the only one who escaped to tell you." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Job's knees buckled, the world tilted. Everything, his wealth, his servants, his children, swept away in a single afternoon. 10 children, gone. The laughter that filled his home just this morning, silenced forever. His hands trembled as he reached up and tore his robe from top to bottom, the ancient sign of mourning. He picked up a blade and shaved his head. Then, with tears streaming down his face, Job fell to the ground. Everyone watching expected him to scream, to rage, to curse heaven for allowing such horror. But what Job did next would echo through eternity. He worshipped. Through tears and the weight of loss, Job spoke. "Naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked I will depart. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. May the name of the Lord be praised." Let that sink in. Job didn't understand what was happening. He didn't know about the heavenly courtroom, about Satan's accusation, about the cosmic question his response was answering. He only knew agony, crushing, unbearable agony. And yet he chose worship, not because the pain wasn't real, not because he was pretending to be fine. He tore his clothes, he shaved his head, he acknowledged the devastation. But even in his grief, Job recognized a truth Satan wanted to disprove. Everything he had was a gift, not an entitlement. The Lord gave freely, generously, without obligation. And the Lord took away, mysteriously, painfully, without explanation. But in both the giving and the taking, God remained worthy of praise. Not because the circumstances made sense, but because God's character doesn't change based on our circumstances. We know this kind of devastation, the phone call that changes everything, the diagnosis that steals your future, the accident that takes someone you can't imagine living without, the moment when life as you knew it collapses in a single day. Job's response teaches us something profound. Worship in the worst moment isn't denial. It's declaration. Job didn't say, "I'm fine." He said, "The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away." He acknowledged the loss. He honored the giver. Job's faith wasn't built on what God had given him. It was built on who God is, and that's the kind of faith Satan cannot break. But Satan wasn't finished. If stripping away Job's blessings couldn't destroy his devotion, perhaps attacking his body would. Satan returned to the heavenly courtroom, furious and bewildered. Job had passed the first test. Despite losing everything, he had not cursed God. The accuser's prediction had failed. But Satan wasn't ready to concede defeat. Once again, the angels assembled before God's throne. And once again, God turned to Satan. "Where have you come from?" The same reply, "From roaming throughout the earth, going back and forth on it." Then God spoke words that must have stunned the accuser. "Have you considered my servant Job? There is no one on earth like him. He is blameless and upright, a man who fears God and shuns evil, and he still maintains his integrity, though you incited me against him to ruin him without any reason." Notice those last words. Without any reason. Even God acknowledges that Job's suffering wasn't deserved. It wasn't punishment. It wasn't correction. From Job's perspective and ours, it was suffering without cause. But Satan had a response ready. "Skin for skin," he snarled. "A man will give all he has for his own life. But now stretch out your hand and strike his flesh and bones, and he will surely curse you to your face." Satan's logic was cold and calculating. People will sacrifice possessions to save their lives. Job lost his wealth, his children, but he still had his health. Take that away, and his devotion will crumble. True faith, Satan claimed, only exists if it survives physical agony. God's response was measured. "Very well then, he is in your hands, but you must spare his life." Permission granted. Boundary set. Satan could attack Job's body, but he could not take his life. What happened next was devastating. Painful sores broke out over Job's entire body, from the soles of his feet to the crown of his head. The Hebrew suggests something like leprosy, or perhaps a combination of diseases. His skin erupted with festering boils. They oozed, they burned, they itched with maddening intensity. Job took a piece of broken pottery and sat among the ashes, the town's garbage dump where the sick and outcast went to die. There he scraped his wounds, seeking even the faintest relief from torment that never stopped. Imagine it. Every breath brought fresh pain. Every movement reopened wounds. Flies swarmed around the sores. The stench of infection mixed with burning refuse. Sleep became impossible. Comfort, a distant memory. But the physical suffering was only part of Job's agony. In the honor-shame culture of the ancient Near East, appearance mattered profoundly. Job's condition suggested divine curse. Former friends avoided him. People who once sought his counsel now crossed the street to escape his presence. Children mocked him openly. His dignity, once as solid as his wealth, was stripped away. The man who sat at the city gate, whose words shaped communities, whose wisdom commanded respect, now sat in ashes like refuse, unrecognizable, untouchable, alone. Then came a voice he knew better than any other, his wife. She stood before him, this woman who had buried 10 children, who had watched their life collapse, who now saw her husband rotting alive in a garbage heap. Her grief had reached its breaking point. "Are you still maintaining your integrity?" she asked, her voice raw with pain and bitterness. "Curse God and die." We need to understand her words carefully. She wasn't a villain. She was a devastated mother and wife drowning in trauma. She had lost everything too, and watching Job suffer with such stubborn faith while God remained silent, it was too much. Death seemed like mercy compared to this slow torture. But Job, even through his agony, responded with gentle firmness. "You are talking like a foolish woman. Shall we accept good from God and not trouble?" It's a question that cuts to the heart of faith. Do we worship God only when life is comfortable? Is our devotion conditional on blessing? Or is there something deeper, something that holds even when everything else is stripped away? Job wasn't claiming to understand. He wasn't pretending the suffering was easy or that it made sense. But he refused to let pain redefine who God is. The text adds a crucial detail. In all this, Job did not sin in what he said. He passed the second test. Satan's prediction failed again. Job's faith survived not just the loss of blessings, but the assault on his body. His worship wasn't rooted in comfort, it was rooted in God's character. We know what this feels like. Chronic illness that never relents. Depression that clouds every moment. Physical pain that becomes the backdrop of existence. The suffering that others can't see, but that shapes every breath you take. Job's story doesn't minimize that pain. It doesn't offer quick fixes or claim that faith makes suffering disappear. What it shows us is that faith can endure even when the body is failing. That worship can rise from ashes and broken pottery. That devotion to God doesn't depend on physical wholeness. Job's body was broken, his world was shattered, but his faith, tested beyond what most of us can imagine, remained intact. And that's what Satan could not comprehend or destroy. But Job's trials were far from over. Word of his catastrophe had spread, and 3 friends were already traveling across the desert, coming to offer comfort. What they would find when they arrived, and what they would say, would add another layer to Job's suffering. News of Job's calamity traveled fast across the ancient trade routes. Word spread from caravan to caravan, from town to town. Job, the greatest man in the East, had lost everything. His wealth gone, his children dead, his body ravaged by disease. 3 men heard the news and were shaken to their core. Eliphaz the Temanite, Bildad the Shuhite, Zophar the Naamathite. These weren't casual acquaintances. They were likely tribal leaders themselves, men of influence and wisdom from distant regions. But more than that, they were Job's friends. They had shared counsel with him, broken bread at his table, respected him deeply. When they heard what had happened, they didn't hesitate. Each set out from his own land, and they met together by agreement. They would travel as one to mourn with Job and comfort him. It's worth pausing to appreciate this. These men dropped everything. They left their own households, their own responsibilities, and journeyed across harsh desert terrain to be with their friend in his darkest hour. Their intentions were pure, their concern genuine, but nothing could have prepared them for what they found. As they approached from a distance, they saw a figure sitting in the ash heap. At first, they weren't sure it was Job. The man they remembered had been robust, healthy, commanding. This figure was skeletal, covered in sores, scraping his skin with broken pottery. Then recognition hit. When they saw him from a distance, they could hardly recognize him. The shock was visceral. They began to weep aloud, not polite tears, but deep, guttural sobs that came from the chest. This was their friend. This was the man who had been a pillar of strength, now reduced to something barely human. They tore their robes in the ancient ritual of mourning. They sprinkled dust on their heads, another sign of devastating grief. These weren't empty gestures. They were expressions of solidarity, of shared pain, of entering into Job's suffering as fully as they could. And then they did something extraordinary. They sat down beside him in the ashes, amid the filth and stench of decay. They didn't keep their distance. They didn't stand apart. They lowered themselves to where Job was and simply stayed. For 7 days and 7 nights, no one spoke a word. Let that image settle. 1 week, 168 hours, complete silence, because they saw how great his suffering was. The friends understood something profound in that moment. Job's pain was too deep for quick answers, his loss too great for easy comfort. Some suffering is so overwhelming that words feel like an insult to its weight, so they honored Job's grief with their presence. They sat in the ashes with him. They let the silence stretch across days. They didn't rush to explain or fix or theologize. They simply were there. This is the friends at their absolute best. Before they open their mouths, before they begin their speeches, before they start offering counsel, right here in the sacred silence, they get it right. In their silence, Job's friends reflected the heart of God more than they knew. Because before answers come, sometimes love looks like presence. It's the same kind of love Jesus showed when he wept with those who mourned. There is profound ministry in presence, in showing up when others stay away, in sitting with someone in their pain without trying to make it better, in being willing to enter the uncomfortable, awkward, terrible space of another person's suffering and just stay. We forget this in our rush to help. When someone is grieving, we want to say something meaningful. We want to offer perspective or hope or explanation. We feel awkward in silence, so we fill it with words. But sometimes the greatest gift isn't words. It's presence. Sitting in the hospital room when there's nothing to say. Showing up at the funeral when your own grief makes you want to stay home. Sending the text that says, "I don't have words, but I'm here." Bringing a meal without expecting conversation, staying when others have moved on. The friends understood that Job's suffering demanded respect. They didn't minimize it with premature comfort. They didn't rush past it with theological explanations. They let it be what it was, crushing, overwhelming, devastating. For 7 days, they got it right. If only they had stayed silent longer, because what happens next will transform these compassionate mourners into something else entirely. Their silence will break, their words will flow, and their well-intentioned counsel will become another trial for Job to endure. But we're not there yet. Right now, in this moment, we need to see the beauty of what they're doing. 3 men who traveled far to sit in ashes with their friend. 3 men who valued presence over answers. 3 men who understood that sometimes love means simply being there. When someone you know is suffering, really suffering, the kind that has no quick resolution, remember Job's friends in their first week. Don't rush to fill the silence with spiritual platitudes. Don't offer explanations for pain you don't understand. Don't say, everything happens for a reason, or God needed another angel, or at least just show up, sit down, stay. Let your presence speak what words cannot. You're not alone. I see your pain. I'm not leaving. That's what Job needed. That's what his friends gave him for 7 days. On the 8th day, the silence broke. Job finally could hold it in no longer, and what poured out of him was a cry so raw, so honest, so desperate that it would change the entire tone of the conversation. For 7 days, silence hung over the ash heap like a burial shroud. Job sat motionless, surrounded by his friends, locked in grief too deep for words. Then, on the 8th day, Job opened his mouth, and what came out was a cry from the depths of the human soul. May the day of my birth perish, and the night that said, a boy is conceived. Job didn't curse God. He never cursed God, but he cursed his own existence. The pain had become so unbearable that non-existence seemed preferable to another breath, another wave of agony. His lament poured out in poetry, raw, brutally honest. That day, may it turn to darkness. May God above not care about it. May no light shine on it. Job wanted to erase himself from the timeline of history, to rewind creation to the moment before he existed and stop there. If he had never been born, he would never have known this suffering. Why did I not perish at birth and die as I came from the womb? Why were there knees to receive me and breasts that I might be nursed? Questions from someone at the limit of human endurance. Why continue living if life is only suffering? Why was he allowed to survive infancy only to face this unbearable adulthood? Job envied the dead, those who rest in the grave, who no longer feel pain, who are beyond the reach of life's cruelties. For now, I would be lying down in peace. I would be asleep and at rest with kings and rulers of the earth, or with princes who had gold. There the wicked cease from turmoil, and there the weary are at rest. Death looked like mercy. The grave looked like refuge. Anything seemed better than this endless torment. But notice what Job is doing here. He's bringing his unfiltered emotions directly to God. No religious performance, no pretending to be okay, no sanitized prayers that hide the real anguish of his heart. This is lament, and it's deeply biblical. The Psalms are full of it. My God, why have you forsaken me? How long, O Lord, will you forget me forever? I am worn out from my groaning. All night long I flood my bed with weeping. Lament isn't the opposite of faith. It's faith refusing to let go even when holding on hurts. It's crying out to God instead of walking away from Him. There's a profound difference between wrestling with God and abandoning Him. Job was wrestling. He continued, "Why is light given to those in misery and life to the bitter of soul, to those who long for death that does not come, who search for it more than for hidden treasure?" Here's the paradox. Job wanted death, but death wouldn't come. He was trapped between a life too painful to bear and a death he couldn't reach. The hedge God had placed around him, once protection, now felt like a prison. What I feared has come upon me. What I dreaded has happened to me. I have no peace, no quietness. I have no rest, but only turmoil. Job's lament reveals something we often try to hide. Even the faithful sometimes wish they'd never been born. Even the righteous sometimes long for death. Even those who love God sometimes feel trapped in suffering with no escape. And Scripture preserves his cry as it was, real faith in raw form. It doesn't edit out his pain or demand he sound more spiritual. It gives his anguish a voice. We need permission to lament. In a culture that demands positivity, that spiritualizes every struggle, that expects us to always see the blessing in the trial, Job's lament reminds us that sometimes faith sounds like, "I wish I'd never been born." If you've ever prayed through tears or questioned God in your pain, you're not alone. Sometimes the most faithful thing you can do is tell God exactly how you feel. Not what you think you should feel, not what sounds spiritual, but the truth. This hurts. I don't understand. I can't see the purpose, and right now, I wish this had never happened to me. God would rather have your honest pain than your polite pretense. Job doesn't have answers yet. He can't see God's hand in any of this. He doesn't know about the heavenly courtroom or Satan's accusation or the cosmic question his suffering is answering. All he knows is agony, and all he can do is cry out. But here's what matters. He's still crying out to God, not away from Him, to Him. That's the difference between lament and despair. Lament says, "God, where are you?" Despair says, "There is no God." Lament says, "I don't understand your ways." Despair says, "There are no ways to understand." Job is lamenting, and his friends, who have sat in compassionate silence for 7 days, are about to respond. What they say next will turn comfort into confrontation and silence into accusation. The sacred silence is broken. Job's lament has hung in the air for what feels like an eternity. And now, Eliphaz the Temanite, the eldest and perhaps wisest of the 3 friends, can no longer hold his tongue. What follows over the next several chapters is 3 rounds of dialogue where each friend tries to make sense of Job's suffering. Their intentions are sincere, their theology is deeply held, but their counsel is profoundly misguided. Instead of dissecting each friend, let's look at the shared errors that turned compassion into accusation. Eliphaz speaks first. his tone gentle, but his message sharp. Consider now, who, being innocent, has ever perished? Where were the upright ever destroyed? His logic is simple. Innocent people don't suffer like this. If Job is experiencing such devastating loss, there must be a reason. Hidden sin, secret wickedness, something Job has done to deserve God's judgment. He appeals to a mystical vision. A spirit glided past my face. Then I heard a voice. Can a mortal be more righteous than God? Can anyone be purer than their Maker? The implication is clear. Job, you're not as righteous as you think. Your suffering is proof. Bildad is more blunt. He appeals to the wisdom of the ancestors. Ask the former generation and find out what their ancestors learned. His message, this has always been true. The wicked are punished. If Job's children died, surely they sinned. When your children sinned against him, he gave them over to the penalty of their sin. Imagine hearing those words as a grieving father. Your 10 children, dead in a collapsed house, and your friend suggests they deserved it. Zophar is the harshest of all. Know this, God has even forgotten some of your sin. In other words, you're getting off easy, Job. Your suffering could be worse. God is being merciful by not giving you the full punishment you deserve. All 3 friends operate from the same assumption. Suffering equals sin. Good people are blessed. Bad people suffer. There are no exceptions. The math is simple. But Job's story demolishes this theology. The righteous do suffer. Blessing and suffering aren't always tied to behavior, and reducing God's ways to a simple formula is not wisdom. It's arrogance disguised as orthodoxy. We still hear these voices today. What sin are you hiding? If you had more faith, you'd be healed. God must be teaching you something. These statements wound because they assume knowledge the speaker doesn't possess. Sometimes suffering is consequence, sometimes it's discipline, but sometimes, as with Job, it's neither. It's living in a broken world. It's being tested in ways we don't understand. It's mystery that refuses to fit our categories. The inverse of their first error is equally damaging. If suffering indicates sin, then prosperity indicates righteousness. Eliphaz promises, submit to God and be at peace with him. In this way, prosperity will come to you. Bildad agrees. If you are pure and upright, even now he will rouse himself on your behalf and restore you to your prosperous state. The message is transactional. Confess your sin, return to God, and the blessings will flow again. This is the seed of what we now call the prosperity gospel, the dangerous idea that we can control God's blessings through our behavior. But this theology makes God predictable, controllable, a cosmic vending machine where righteousness is the coin we insert to receive blessing. Job's story shatters this illusion. Yes, Job was blessed when he was faithful, but he was also faithful when the blessings were stripped away. His righteousness wasn't a transaction, it was a relationship. And relationships with God don't operate on formulas. The friends can't imagine suffering that isn't correction or punishment, suffering that's simply mystery. Perhaps the most tragic error is this. The friends think they're defending God's honor. They believe they're protecting his reputation by explaining Job's suffering as deserved. But in doing so, they wound the suffering and misrepresent God. Job will later say to them, "Miserable comforters are you all. Will your long-winded speeches never end?" They came to mourn. They became prosecutors. They came to comfort. They became judges. And God himself will eventually rebuke them. "I am angry with you, because you have not spoken the truth about me, as my servant Job has." Here's the painful irony. Job, who questioned and lamented and cried out in confusion, spoke more truly about God than the friends who defended him with rigid theology. Why? Because Job spoke honestly to God. The friends spoke about God without compassion. Job brought his real heart, messy, broken, confused. The friends brought their neat categories: tidy, logical, wrong. When someone shares their pain, they don't need a sermon. They need solidarity. When someone is suffering, they don't need you to explain why. They need you to sit with them in the not knowing. The friends' mistake wasn't that they had theology, it's that their theology lacked mercy. They prioritized being right over being kind. They chose explanations over empathy, and in doing so, they added another layer of suffering to a man already crushed under more weight than any person should bear. You might not sit on an ash heap like Job's friends, but you will stand beside someone whose world has fallen apart, and your words will either heal or harm. What Job needed, and what all suffering people need, is someone to say, "I don't know why this is happening. I can't explain it, but I'm here, and I'm not leaving." The friends couldn't do that. They needed answers. They needed Job's suffering to make sense. So they created explanations that fit their theology, even when those explanations crucified their friend. Job is about to respond. And his words will reveal a man defending his integrity while crying out for understanding. A man who refuses to accept false guilt, but desperately longs for God to break his silence. Job listens to his friends' accusations, and something shifts inside him. These men came to comfort, but their words became torture, accusing him of sins he didn't commit, reducing his pain to equations he knew were false. Job refuses to accept their verdict. Over the course of several responses, Job defends his integrity, wrestles with God's silence, and searches desperately for justice in a universe that seems to have lost its moral order. His speeches are raw, contradictory, sometimes angry, and utterly faithful. Let's examine his responses by theme rather than chronologically, because Job's heart reveals itself not in neat progression, but in passionate wrestling. Job will not falsely confess. "I will never admit you are in the right. Till I die, I will not deny my integrity. I will maintain my innocence and never let go of it. My conscience will not reproach me as long as I live." This isn't arrogance. Job acknowledges that no human is perfectly sinless. How can a mortal be righteous before God? He knows human frailty. He understands that everyone falls short. But he also knows the difference between general human weakness and the specific, heinous sin his friends are accusing him of. They're claiming his suffering is punishment, that his children died because of his wickedness, that God is judging him for crimes he must have committed. And Job knows that's not true. To confess sins he didn't commit would be lying to God, which would be worse than maintaining his case. So Job holds his ground. "I am blameless, but I have no concern for myself. I despise my own life." He's not claiming perfection, just innocence of the charges against him. And he refuses to trade truth for false peace. Sometimes we're pressured to accept blame we don't own, to apologize for what we didn't do just to keep the peace, to confess to explanations that don't fit our reality. Job teaches us that there's integrity in saying, "No, that's not what happened. I won't lie to make you comfortable." One of Job's most profound longings appears in chapter 9. "If only there were someone to mediate between us, someone to bring us together, to remove God's rod from me, so that his terror would frighten me no more." Job feels the vast distance between himself and God. How can a human argue with the Almighty? The scales are impossibly imbalanced. God is infinite in power and knowledge. Job is finite, fragile, limited. How can I dispute with him? How can I find words to argue with him? Though I were innocent, I could not answer him. I could only plead with my judge for mercy. What Job longs for is a bridge, someone who stands between humanity and divinity, who can represent both sides, who can make a fair hearing possible. He doesn't know it, but his cry is prophetic. Centuries later, his longing will find fulfillment in Jesus Christ, the mediator between God and humanity. the one who is fully God and fully human, who bridges the gap Job felt so acutely. For there is one God and one mediator between God and mankind, the man Christ Jesus. Job's cry for a mediator wasn't answered in his lifetime, but it points to the gospel's heartbeat, that God himself would bridge the distance. Even in despair, sparks of faith break through Job's darkness. In chapter 13, he makes one of Scripture's most powerful declarations. Though he slay me, yet will I hope in him. I will surely defend my ways to his face. This is paradox, trusting God even while questioning him, hoping in God even while feeling abandoned by him. It's faith at its most honest and most resilient. Have you ever held on to faith, not because you understood God, but because you couldn't let go of him? But Job's most astonishing statement comes in chapter 19. I know that my Redeemer lives, and that in the end he will stand on the earth. And after my skin has been destroyed, yet in my flesh I will see God. I myself will see him with my own eyes, I and not another. How my heart yearns within me. This isn't vague optimism, this is eschatological hope. Job believes in bodily resurrection. He believes in ultimate vindication, even if it comes after death. He trusts that there will be a final reckoning where truth prevails and God sets all things right. Sitting in ashes, covered in sores, accused by his friends, abandoned by his community, Job declares, "My Redeemer lives." That's not the statement of someone whose faith has collapsed. That's the cry of someone whose faith goes deeper than circumstances. Job demands an audience with God. I would state my case before him and fill my mouth with arguments. I would find out what he would answer me and consider what he would say to me. He believes desperately, passionately, that if he could just explain his case to God face to face, justice would prevail. If God would listen, truly listen, he would see that Job doesn't deserve this suffering. Oh, that I had someone to hear me. I sign now my defense. Let the Almighty answer me. Job wants his day in court. He wants to present evidence. He wants God to explain the charges against him. He's willing to face divine judgment if only the process is fair, if only he gets to speak, if only the reasons are made clear. We've all been there, pleading for answers, asking God to explain the unexplainable, longing for clarity more than comfort. But that courtroom scene he's demanding, it's coming, just not in the way Job expects. Job's responses are messy, contradictory, sometimes crossing the line into presumption. But through it all, one thing remains constant. He won't let go of God. He won't curse him. He won't walk away. He's wrestling, and wrestling with God is still relationship with God. His friends have said their piece. Job has defended himself. The debate has reached an impasse. Everyone is entrenched in their positions. Job's words have emptied him, but heaven isn't silent forever. And then a new voice breaks through, younger, unexpected, but speaking with a different spirit than the three friends who came before. The debate between Job and his three friends has reached a stalemate. Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar have run out of arguments. Job has defended his integrity and refuses to budge. The air is thick with tension and unresolved frustration. Then a voice speaks that no one expected. I am young in years and you are old. That is why I was fearful, not daring to tell you what I know. I thought age should speak, advanced years should teach wisdom. But it is the spirit in a person, the breath of the Almighty, that gives them understanding. His name is Elihu, son of Barachel the Buzite. He's been there the whole time, listening, waiting, watching this theological battle unfold. As the youngest person present, custom demanded his silence. Elders spoke first. Wisdom belonged to the aged. But Elihu has grown increasingly frustrated, not just with Job, but with all three friends. And now he can no longer contain himself. I am full of words, and the spirit within me compels me to speak. Unlike the three friends who came before him, Elihu doesn't claim authority from experience or ancient tradition. He appeals to something else, the Spirit of God who gives understanding regardless of age. Wisdom, he suggests, isn't automatically granted by grey hair. It comes from God. This is important. Elihu positions himself differently. He's not speaking from the arrogance of the old guard. He's speaking from what he believes the Spirit has shown him. Elihu turns first to Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar. I am angry with you. Not one of you has proved Job wrong. None of you has answered his arguments. He sees what they couldn't see. Their theology is too rigid, their categories too neat, their answers too simplistic. They kept insisting Job must have sinned, but they couldn't actually prove it. They reduced mystery to formulas. God is greater than any mortal. Why do you complain to him that he responds to no one's words? The friends thought they were defending God, but in reality, they were limiting him, reducing divine sovereignty to human logic, shrinking infinite wisdom to fit their finite understanding. But Elihu doesn't let Job off the hook either. He challenges the tone of Job's speeches, not the substance of his innocence, but the way he's been presenting his case. You say, I am pure, I have done no wrong. I am clean and free from sin. But I tell you, in this you are not right, for God is greater than any mortal. Elihu isn't accusing Job of the sins the friends claimed. He's warning Job about a different danger, self-righteousness that elevates human innocence to the point of questioning divine justice. Job has been so focused on defending his integrity that some of his statements have begun to sound like accusations against God. God has wronged me. He tears me down. He counts me among his enemies. Elihu gently pushes back. Be careful, Job. In defending yourself, don't put God on trial. Here's where Elihu offers something genuinely new, a third category beyond punishment and randomness. God does speak, now one way, now another, though no one perceives it. In a dream, in a vision of the night, when deep sleep falls on people as they slumber in their beds, he may speak in their ears and terrify them with warnings to turn them from wrongdoing and keep them from pride. Suffering, Elihu suggests, can be God's voice, not always punishing, not always correcting specific sins, sometimes warning, sometimes preparing, sometimes humbling us to teach dependence on him rather than ourselves. He may be chastened on a bed of pain with constant distress in their bones, to preserve them from the pit, their lives from perishing by the sword. This is suffering as preparation rather than punishment. God using pain to redirect, to refine, to prevent even greater harm down the road. It's not that Job deserved what happened, but perhaps God is working purposes Job can't yet see. Elihu doesn't claim to fully explain Job's suffering. He's opening a new possibility. Not all pain is punishment. Some is protective, some is transformative. But here's the crucial part. Elihu doesn't know about the heavenly conversation either. He's offering a better framework than the three friends, but he still doesn't have the full picture. None of them do. Sometimes before God speaks, he sends someone to remind us we're still being heard. Throughout his speeches, Elihu repeatedly defends God's character. Far be it from God to do evil, from the Almighty to do wrong. He repays everyone for what they have done. He brings on them what their conduct deserves. But unlike the friends, Elihu balances God's justice with God's inscrutability. Yes, God is just, but his ways are beyond human comprehension. The Almighty is beyond our reach, and exalted in power. In his justice and great righteousness he does not oppress. Therefore people revere him. Elihu's words serve as the bridge between human reasoning and divine revelation, the last human voice before heaven itself speaks. Elihu is preparing the ground for what's about to happen. He's shifting the conversation away from human arguments about who's right and who's wrong. He's pointing everyone's attention back to God himself, his majesty, his power, his wisdom that transcends human categories. Elihu's words hint at what Job's story has been teaching all along, that God's silence doesn't mean his absence. As Elihu speaks, something is happening in the natural world around them. His final words turn to the weather. Listen to this, Job. Stop and consider God's wonders. Do you know how God controls the clouds and makes his lightning flash? Do you know how the clouds hang poised, those wonders of him who has perfect knowledge? Dark clouds are gathering on the horizon. Wind begins to stir. The air grows heavy with the electricity of an approaching storm. Elihu doesn't know it, but his speech is preparing everyone for what comes next. He's been talking about God's power, God's majesty, God's ways that surpass human understanding. And now God himself is about to speak. The sky darkens, the ground trembles, and every heart falls silent. The whirlwind is coming. And everything, all the human words, all the theological debates, all the accusations and defenses, is about to be swallowed up in the voice that made the stars. The storm that Elihu described is no longer distant. Dark clouds swirl overhead. Wind howls across the desert. Dust rises in spinning columns. The air crackles with divine energy. And then, from the heart of the whirlwind, a voice speaks. Not the gentle whisper Elijah heard in the cave. Not the still, small voice of comfort. This is the raw, elemental, untamed voice of the Creator breaking through the natural order. Then the Lord spoke to Job out of the storm. This is the moment everything changes. The Creator answers the creature. After 35 chapters of human voices, Job's cries, his friends' accusations, Elihu's speeches, God finally breaks his silence. But he doesn't answer Job's questions. He asks his own. Who is this that obscures my plans with words without knowledge? The question hangs in the air. Job has been demanding answers, insisting on explanations, calling God to account. But God's opening words make clear Job has been speaking about things he doesn't understand. Brace yourself like a man. I will question you, and you shall answer me. Job wanted a courtroom where he could present his case. God gives him a courtroom, but reverses the roles. Job wanted to question God. Instead, God will question Job. What follows is not explanation, but revelation. God takes Job on a cosmic tour through creation, asking questions that no human can answer. Where were you when I laid the earth's foundation? Tell me if you understand. Who marked off its dimensions? Surely you know. Job wasn't there when God spoke the universe into existence. He didn't measure the earth or set its cornerstone. He didn't hear the morning stars sing together or see the angels shout for joy at creation's birth. Who shut up the sea behind doors when it burst forth from the womb, when I made the clouds its garment and wrapped it in thick darkness, when I fixed limits for it and set its doors and bars in place, when I said, this far you may come and no farther, here is where your proud waves halt? Job lives by the sea, but he didn't set its boundaries. He's seen storms, but he didn't create the forces that drive them. The natural world operates by laws Job observes, but didn't author. God's questions cascade like waves. Have you ever given orders to the morning, or shown the dawn its place? Have you journeyed to the springs of the sea, or walked in the recesses of the deep? Have the gates of death been shown to you? Each question highlights the vast gulf between creator and creature. Job hasn't explored the ocean depths. He doesn't command the sunrise. He can't see beyond death's door. Can you bind the chains of the Pleiades? Can you loosen Orion's belt? Can you bring forth the constellations in their seasons or lead out the bear with its cubs? Do you know the laws of the heavens? Can you set up God's dominion over the earth? Job looks up at the stars every night, but he didn't hang them in the sky. The cosmos operates on a scale and complexity that dwarfs human comprehension. Then God shifts to the creatures that fill the earth. Do you hunt the prey for the lioness and satisfy the hunger of the lions? Who provides food for the raven when its young cry out to God? The God who governs galaxies also feeds sparrows. The one who commands the stars also cares for the smallest creatures. Do you know when the mountain goats give birth? Do you watch when the doe bears her fawn? Who let the wild donkey go free? Who untied its ropes? God describes animals Job has never tamed: the wild donkey that scorns the city's commotion, the wild ox that refuses to serve, the ostrich that flaps her wings joyfully though she's senseless, the horse that laughs at fear and charges into battle. Does the hawk take flight by your wisdom and spread its wings toward the south? Does the eagle soar at your command and build its nest on high? Creation teems with life Job didn't design and can't control. Every creature operates according to instincts and purposes God built into them, purposes that often surpass human understanding. Finally, God describes two massive creatures that embody raw, untamable power. Behemoth, possibly a hippopotamus or elephant, whose bones are tubes of bronze, his limbs like rods of iron. And Leviathan, perhaps a crocodile or mythic sea creature, so fierce that nothing on earth is its equal, a creature without fear. The point is unmistakable. If Job can't control these creatures, how can he challenge the one who created them? God doesn't explain why Job suffered. He doesn't mention the heavenly courtroom or Satan's accusation. He doesn't give Job the clarity he pleaded for. Instead, God reveals who he is. The answer to why becomes I am. God's sovereignty isn't defensive, it's definitional. He governs the universe with perfect wisdom. If Job can't understand the complexities of the natural world he lives in, how can he grasp the complexities of divine providence? We all want answers, but sometimes God gives us something better, himself. The questions fade, but the presence remains. The whirlwind still swirls. The voice still thunders. And Job, who has had so much to say for 35 chapters, is about to respond with words that will change everything. The whirlwind still roars around them. God's questions hang in the air like thunder. And Job, who has spent 35 chapters defending himself, questioning God, demanding answers, finally speaks. But his tone has changed completely. I am unworthy. How can I reply to you? I put my hand over my mouth. I spoke once, but I have no answer. Twice, but I will say no more. This isn't full resolution yet. It's stunned silence. Job realizes he's been speaking beyond his understanding, arguing about matters too vast for human comprehension. He covers his mouth, the ancient gesture of humility before overwhelming truth. But God isn't finished. The voice from the whirlwind continues with even more pointed questions. Would you discredit my justice? Would you condemn me to justify yourself? The question cuts to the heart of what's been happening. In defending his innocence, which was real, Job's words have sometimes crossed a line. He's been so focused on proving he didn't deserve this suffering that he's come close to putting God on trial. Do you have an arm like God's, and can your voice thunder like his? Then adorn yourself with glory and splendor, and clothe yourself in honor and majesty. God isn't mocking Job, he's revealing perspective. If Job thinks he can govern the universe with greater justice than God, let him try. Let him judge the wicked, humble the proud, bring cosmic order out of chaos. Then God describes Behemoth and Leviathan in even greater detail, creatures of such raw power that no human can tame them. Can you pull in Leviathan with a fishhook? Will traders barter for it? Can you fill its hide with harpoons? The message is clear. If Job can't control these creatures, how can he challenge the Creator? And this time, when God finishes speaking, Job responds, not with silence, but with surrender. I know that you can do all things. No purpose of yours can be thwarted. This is Job's first declaration. God's sovereignty is absolute. His plans cannot be stopped. His purposes will prevail. Job has learned what he couldn't see from the ash heap, that divine wisdom operates on a scale infinitely beyond human perception. You asked, "Who is this that obscures my plans without knowledge? Surely I spoke of things I did not understand, things too wonderful for me to know." Job acknowledges it plainly. He was speaking about matters beyond his comprehension, not that his pain wasn't real, not that his questions weren't honest, but that the cosmic reality behind his suffering was far more complex than he could grasp. Then comes the line that transforms everything. My ears had heard of you, but now my eyes have seen you. This is the breakthrough. Job has moved from second-hand knowledge to first-hand encounter, from inherited faith to personal revelation, from knowing about God to knowing God. All his life, Job had been righteous. He offered sacrifices. He feared God. He avoided evil. He did everything right. But his relationship with God was built on what he'd been taught, what tradition said, what he'd heard from others. Now, stripped of everything, sitting in ashes, ravaged by suffering he didn't understand, Job has encountered God directly, and that encounter changes him more than all the blessings ever did. Therefore, I despise myself and repent in dust and ashes. The word repent here deserves careful attention. The Hebrew word nacham can mean to relent, to be comforted, or to change one's mind. Job isn't repenting of specific sins. He wasn't guilty of what his friends accused him of. He's surrendering his demand for answers. He's releasing his need to understand. He's laying down his insistence on justification. Job's repentance isn't about guilt. It's about trust restored. Dust and ashes is where Job has been sitting throughout this ordeal. But now, instead of sitting there in defiant confusion, demanding God explain himself, Job sits in humbled worship. Maybe you've been there. Nothing around you changes, but something inside does. Externally, nothing has changed. He's still in ashes. His children are still dead. His body still bears the scars of disease. What changed is his vision of God. Before, my ears had heard of you. Knowledge passed down, faith inherited, God at a distance. Now, my eyes have seen you, encounter, revelation, direct experience of divine majesty. And in that encounter, Job's need for answers shrinks. Not because the questions stop mattering, but because he's overwhelmed by who God is. The mystery no longer torments him because he trusts the mystery maker. This is what makes Job's story so profound. Peace doesn't come from answered questions. It comes from encountering the one who holds the answers. True faith doesn't erase the pain. It redefines it through encounter. Job stops demanding explanation because he's overwhelmed by revelation. He stops insisting on understanding because he's encountered someone worth trusting even without understanding. The man who wanted a courtroom got a whirlwind. The man who demanded clarity received mystery. But the man who thought he knew God discovered he'd barely begun to grasp his majesty. And somehow, impossibly, that was enough. We all reach moments when answers won't help. Only presence will. He came into the storm with questions. He leaves with peace. Job's testing is complete. His faith, proven genuine through unimaginable trial, has withstood everything Satan threw at it. The cosmic question has been answered. Now comes the restoration. The whirlwind subsides. The voice from the storm falls silent. Job sits in humbled worship, having encountered God in ways that have transformed him from the inside out. But the story isn't over. God has one more thing to do, and it begins not with Job, but with his 3 friends. After the Lord had said these things to Job, he said to Eliphaz the Temanite, "I am angry with you and your 2 friends, because you have not spoken the truth about me, as my servant Job has." Let that statement sink in. Job, who questioned, who lamented, who cried out in confusion and pain, spoke more truly about God than the friends who defended him with rigid orthodoxy. Why? Because Job spoke honestly to God. He brought his real heart, messy, broken, confused, directly into God's presence. The friends spoke about God without compassion, reducing infinite wisdom to tidy formulas. Job's wrestling was more faithful than their certainty. God's anger with the friends is serious. They misrepresented his character. They wounded a suffering man with false theology. They claimed to speak for God while actually obscuring his truth. But God's justice includes mercy. He provides a way forward. So now take 7 bulls and 7 rams and go to my servant Job and sacrifice a burnt offering for yourselves. My servant Job will pray for you, and I will accept his prayer and not deal with you according to your folly. Notice the irony. The very man they accused of sin is now the one who must intercede for them. The man they judged is the one whose prayers will save them from judgment. Like Christ to come, Job intercedes for those who wronged him. And Job, who has every right to be bitter, to refuse, to let them face the consequences of their cruelty, does exactly what God asks. He prays for his friends. This is grace embodied. Job extends mercy before he receives restoration. He forgives before his own circumstances change. He intercedes for those who wounded him. Maybe you've been there, called to forgive before your situation ever changed. After Job had prayed for his friends, the Lord restored his fortunes and gave him twice as much as he had before. The restoration comes after intercession. Job's heart must turn from self-focus to others before blessing returns. His suffering didn't just test his faith, it transformed it into grace. God doesn't just restore what was lost, he doubles it. 14,000 sheep where there had been 7,000, 6,000 camels where there had been 3,000, 1,000 yoke of oxen where there had been 500. 1,000 donkeys where there had been 500. The Lord blessed the latter part of Job's life more than the former part. But the restoration isn't just material. Something deeper is happening. All his brothers and sisters and everyone who had known him before came and ate with him in his house. These are the people who stayed away when Job sat in ashes, the relatives who kept their distance, the community members who avoided him when he looked cursed. Now they return, bringing comfort, offering consolation, each one giving him a piece of silver and a gold ring. The isolation is broken. Job is welcomed back into human community. His dignity is restored along with his wealth. Then comes perhaps the most tender detail, and he also had 7 sons and 3 daughters. God gives Job children again, not as replacements. No parent who has lost a child thinks in terms of replacement, but as new life after devastating loss, as hope after grief, as evidence that God can bring beauty from ashes. The text does something unusual here. It names Job's daughters, Jemimah, Keziah, and Keren-Happuch. The sons remain unnamed, which was common in patriarchal texts, but the daughters are named and described. Nowhere in all the land were there found women as beautiful as Job's daughters. And then this remarkable detail: their father granted them an inheritance along with their brothers. In a culture where daughters typically received nothing, where inheritance passed through sons alone, Job gives his daughters equal standing. His suffering has deepened his sense of justice, his understanding of dignity, his commitment to equity. The man who encountered God in the whirlwind now reflects God's character in unexpected ways. After this, Job lived 140 years. He saw his children and their children to the fourth generation. Job doesn't just survive his trial, he thrives. 4 generations, great-great-grandchildren playing in his home, laughter replacing the silence that grief had brought, life abundant and full, stretching out across decades. And so Job died, an old man and full of years. Full of years, not just old, but satisfied, not just surviving, but complete. The Hebrew suggests contentment, fulfillment, a life that reached its proper measure. But we need to be careful here. Job's restoration is descriptive, not prescriptive. The Bible is showing us what happened to Job, not promising it will happen to everyone who suffers faithfully. Some believers die in poverty. Some lose children and never have more. Some suffer chronically without earthly resolution. Paul's thorn in the flesh wasn't removed. Stephen was martyred. John the Baptist was beheaded. Job's restoration demonstrates that God can restore, but it doesn't guarantee he always will, at least not in this life. God may not restore everything you've lost in this life, but he will restore you. What Job's story does promise is this: God's plans cannot be thwarted. What Satan meant to destroy, God rebuilt. And ultimate restoration for all who trust God through suffering comes not necessarily now, but certainly in the new creation, when God will wipe every tear and make all things new. Job's material restoration points to something greater, the final restoration awaiting all who hold fast to faith through trials they don't understand. God didn't restore Job to reward his faithfulness. Grace doesn't work on merit. Restoration came as a demonstration of God's character. He is not only sovereign in suffering, but faithful in renewal. The man who lost everything received more than he lost, not because he earned it, but because God delights in redemption, because divine plans include restoration, because the God who allows the storm is also the God who brings peace after it. Job's story moves from ashes to abundance, from questions to encounter, from loss to restoration, and in that movement we see the heart of a God who walks with his people through every valley and leads them home. Because in the end, the God of Job is still our God. We've walked with Job from prosperity to devastation, from the ash heap to the whirlwind, from encounter with God to restoration. But a question remains. What does this ancient story teach us about suffering? What do we carry away from Job's journey? Job's story doesn't resolve every question about pain. Instead, it reframes how we hold those questions. Let's examine the key lessons that still speak 3,000 years later. When Job sat in ashes, not knowing about the heavenly conversation, he learned what we must learn. God's sovereignty doesn't mean we'll understand his plans. It means nothing touches our lives without first passing through his hands. Remember the courtroom scene. Satan had to ask permission twice, and both times God set boundaries. You can go this far, but no farther. Even Satan operates within limits God defines. Evil exists, but it doesn't operate independently of divine oversight. This isn't dualism, two equal powers locked in battle. This is a sovereign God who permits what he doesn't prefer, who allows what he doesn't author, all while working purposes we cannot see. And centuries later, another innocent sufferer, Jesus, would prove that even undeserved pain can serve divine purpose. This mystery is uncomfortable. We want clear causation. God either causes everything or causes nothing. But Scripture presents something more complex, a God who governs all things while not being the author of evil, who allows suffering while remaining perfectly good. When trials come, nothing escapes God's authority. We may not know why he permits what he permits, but we can know we're never outside his care. Job's friends were wrong. The righteous do suffer, and blessing and suffering aren't always tied to behavior. Three realities coexist in Scripture. Sometimes suffering is consequence. We reap what we sow. Sometimes suffering is discipline, God correcting those He loves. Sometimes suffering is neither. It's testing, refining, or simply living in a broken world where the rain falls on the just and unjust alike. Job's suffering was the third category. His friends insisted it was the first. Their error caused additional pain because they assumed knowledge they didn't possess. When someone is suffering, we must resist the urge to diagnose why. We don't have access to heavenly conversations. We can't see the full picture. What looks like punishment might be testing. What seems random might be purposeful in ways beyond our sight. The modern versions of the Friends' theology still wound. What sin are you hiding? If you had more faith, you'd be healed. God is trying to teach you something. Sometimes these statements are true, often they're not, and we rarely know which is which. Since we rarely know, we offer presence instead of explanations. Think of the parent who prays for a prodigal child, or the believer who stays faithful through silent years. These are modern echoes of Job's faith. Job's raw laments didn't disqualify his faith, they demonstrated it. He brought his confusion, anger, and questions directly to God. God rebuked the friends for speaking wrongly about him, but never rebuked Job for his honesty. Why? Because Job wrestled with God, not away from him. There's a profound difference. Walking away says, God, I can't trust you, so I'm done. Wrestling says, God, I don't understand you, but I won't let go. Biblical lament, found throughout the Psalms and in Job, models this. Cry out, question, feel abandoned, but keep crying to God, not just about Him. If you're in a season of doubt or pain, bring it to God. He can handle your honesty. Your questions don't scare Him. Lament isn't the opposite of faith. It's faith refusing to let go, even when holding on hurts. Maybe that's where you are right now, barely holding on, but still holding. Job never learned about the heavenly conversation. He died without knowing why he suffered, and that's the point. We want explanations. God offers Himself. We want to understand the blueprint. God asks us to trust the architect. Can you fathom the mysteries of God? Can you probe the limits of the Almighty? The answer is no. And that's okay. The book of Job teaches humility. Some questions won't be answered until we see Him face to face. Faith means trusting when we cannot see, believing when we cannot understand. This doesn't mean we stop asking questions. It means we hold them loosely, knowing the one who holds us. Job's breakthrough wasn't receiving explanation. It was encountering God. My ears had heard of you, but now my eyes have seen you. The shift from second-hand knowledge to first-hand experience changed everything. Job still sat in ashes, his children were still gone, his body still hurt, but seeing God's majesty reframed his suffering. The mystery stopped tormenting him because he trusted the mystery maker. Sometimes peace comes not from answered prayer, but from answered presence. Not God, explain this, but God, I see you, and that's enough. This is what Job's friends couldn't give him. This is what theological formulas can't provide. This is what only encounter with God Himself can bring. So, where does this leave us, those of us who face our own trials without heavenly explanations? Job's story invites us to trust what we cannot see, to worship when heaven feels silent, and to keep walking by faith. To believe that God is working even when we can't perceive His hand. To worship not because we understand, but because we know the one worthy of worship. It invites us to bring honest pain to God instead of polite pretense, to sit with suffering people without rushing to explain, to hold mystery without demanding immediate resolution. It reminds us that faith tested to the breaking point can emerge stronger, not because trials are good, but because the God who walks with us through them is faithful. Job's story doesn't give us the formula for avoiding pain. What it gives us is better. A God big enough to hold our questions, honest enough to let us wrestle, and faithful enough to restore what seems irreparably broken. The mystery remains, but so does he. And that has always been the heart of Job's story. And for those willing to trust beyond understanding, that's enough. From the land of Uz to the whirlwind, we've walked with a man who lost everything, yet refused to let go of God. We saw Job at his peak, blessed, prosperous, faithful, and unshakable. A man whose devotion seemed unbreakable, whose life proved that righteousness and blessing could coexist. We watched as everything crumbled in a single afternoon. Wealth stolen, servants killed, children buried. Then his health failed, his body ravaged, his dignity stripped away. We sat with him through 7 days of sacred silence, then heard his raw cry, "Why was I born?" The lament of a soul pushed beyond endurance. We listened as his friends' comfort turned to accusation, as they insisted his suffering proved hidden sin, as they offered formulas where he needed empathy. We heard Job's responses, defending his integrity, crying out for a mediator, declaring, "Though he slay me, yet will I trust him," proclaiming, "I know that my Redeemer lives." We stood with a younger voice, Elihu, who offered humility where others brought certainty, who prepared hearts for what came next. We experienced the whirlwind, God's voice breaking through with questions that revealed the vast distance between creator and creature, that showed majesty too great for human comprehension. We witnessed Job's surrender, not his integrity, but his demand to understand. My ears had heard of you, but now my eyes have seen you. And we celebrated restoration, doubled possessions, new children, 4 generations of life where there had been death. But what does Job's journey mean for those of us sitting in our own ashes, wrestling with our own unanswered prayers? Job's story offers no quick fixes. It doesn't promise that faithfulness guarantees prosperity or that suffering always ends in this life with happy resolution. What it offers is more profound. The assurance that God is present in the mystery, sovereign in the storm, and faithful even when silent. Maybe your Job season is right now. Maybe you've lost something precious and can't understand why. Maybe you're doing everything right, but life keeps falling apart. Maybe your friends offer religious platitudes when you need someone to just sit with you in the darkness. Maybe you've cried out to God and heard only silence. If so, you're not alone. God still meets people in the ashes. If that's you, hear this. Your questions don't disqualify your faith, and your confusion doesn't mean God's absent. Your pain doesn't mean you're being punished. Like Job, you may never know the why this side of heaven. You may never see the heavenly conversation happening beyond your sight. You may never understand the purposes being worked out in your suffering, but also like Job, you can know the who, the God who sees, who cares, who holds you even in the whirlwind. Job's story invites us to do 3 things. First, bring honest pain to God. Stop pretending you're fine. He already knows you're not. Lament isn't lack of faith, it's faith that still cries out. Tell him exactly how you feel. Your raw honesty honors him more than polite pretense. Second, reject simplistic formulas. Life is more complex than good things equal God's blessing, bad things equal God's punishment. Don't let anyone reduce your suffering to a formula, and don't do it to others. When someone is hurting, offer presence over preaching. Third, trust what you cannot see. The same God who walked with Job through the ashes walks with you. His plans are bigger than your understanding. His purposes are working even when you can't perceive them. And one day, maybe here, maybe in eternity, he will make all things new. Job's story ends with him surrounded by 4 generations of children, sitting not in ashes but at a table full of laughter, full of years, full of life. But between the ashes and the table was a journey through darkness, a journey where he had to trust what he couldn't see, surrender what he couldn't understand, and worship when it hurt to breathe. Maybe that's where you are right now, in the ashes, surrounded by voices that don't understand, crying out to a God who seems silent. But Job's message to you is this: the ashes aren't the end of your story, because every resurrection begins in a tomb. God is still writing. And the same God who met Job in the whirlwind, who restored what Satan tried to destroy, that God sees you, knows you, and walks with you through every moment of suffering you cannot explain. The whirlwind is coming, and after it, the table. If this story spoke to you, I want to hear from you. Drop a comment below and share. What part of Job's journey resonates most with your own experience? Are you in the ashes right now, or have you seen restoration? Your testimony could strengthen someone walking through their own storm. And if you want to keep exploring the deep truths of Scripture with us, stories that still speak to our modern struggles, ancient wisdom that still changes lives, hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Together, we'll keep uncovering the timeless truths that sustain us in our darkest nights. Let's pray together. Lord, help us trust you in silence. Help us worship you in loss. Help us bring our honest pain before your throne, knowing you can handle our questions. Remind us that no storm lasts forever, because you are faithful, even in the ashes. When we cannot see your hand, help us trust your heart. And when answers don't come, help us cling to the answer, the God who is with us, the Savior who bore our suffering, the Spirit who intercedes when we don't have words. Because even when life doesn't make sense, your love still does. We don't understand everything, but we trust you, and that's enough. Because even in the ashes, you are still God. In Jesus' name, amen.